The Universal Church, successor to St. Peter, called Roman Pontiff, Vicar of Christ, Bishop of Rome. All right? Let's get into some particulars. I tried to find some interesting details. The youngest pope was 20 years old in 955.
Wow.
I don't know the particulars of how that happened, but God bless him.
Is this the one that died shortly after he was crowned?
You know, I didn't even look at more than just, I didn't go into more detail to look up about that. The oldest pope was, he was 85 years old when he was elected, so interesting. The last time a pope was elected who was not a cardinal was in 1368, Urban VI. He was a monk and archbishop, so he was already a bishop, so when they had to obviously go get him and bring him back. Since 1378, they always were among the College of Cardinals. And not likely that it will be different than that, unless one day they say, let's go just call Ed Ogden and bring him on. The Pope receives his authority the moment he accepts his lawful election. Now, we don't know if the Pope has decided that he didn't accept it, because we will never hear that, all right? Because what happens in the conclave is supposed to stay in the conclave. Although we often get a little bit of tidbit, but we're not supposed to. That's supposed to be quiet. However, so we wouldn't know, but when he's elected, he will be asked if he accepts the election. If he says no, then they continue voting, and that's it. But when they say yes, that he's the Pope from that moment on. His term of office is for life. The last time I taught this class on this kind of topic was in February of 2013, 5 days before the Pope announced he was resigning. And I had mentioned at the time that a Pope could also resign, but it's not likely. It's not been done in over 600 years. And 3 days later, he was. It was a Thursday when I had the class, and it was on a Sunday night that the Pope made the announcement. They thought I knew something. I did not. He is the official teacher of the church. And that's hard because we're in a time frame when, well, I'll accept it if I like what it is. And that's a hard area to be in. But if we believe that the Holy Spirit is very active and involved in the succession of the leadership of the church, we need to trust that, wherever the person lands. And that's challenging out there, even for the bishops. But they take a vow of obedience to the Pope, and so they need to be in unison. Not that they can have a different point of view, but they should not try to be, this day and age where we have some issues where some bishops are saying the Pope is wrong. Well, that's not their job to say that. That's, you know, it doesn't help the faithful who are trying to, who have a hard enough trying to figure it out as it is. But he is the official teacher. Scripture basis when Jesus gave the keys of the kingdom to Simon Peter. He's official. What they say here is the keys are the official interpreter of Jesus' vision. He's the universal pastor. He's responsible for the universal church. While he's free to consult others and share his authority, he may never surrender it. They're called to be collaborative, but he can't give it up. In fulfilling his office as universal pastor, he is always joined in full communion with the other bishops. That's the challenge. But the Pope does not need their permission to act. There is neither appeal nor recourse against the judgment or decree of a Pope. You can complain in public, but that's not going to change the point of view. Some basic facts. Any Roman Catholic male can be elected Pope. Even Maurice. Actually, you can't be because you're married. But it doesn't say you can't be, if you're already married. But it says any male. Since 1379, every Pope has been selected from the College of Cardinals. Any cardinal under the age of 80 has the right to cast a vote for a new Pope. Those over 80 may attend the pre-conclave, but they cannot vote or go into the conclave. The conclave, this is a pre-conclave gathering, because it's not the Sistine Chapel. If you see the Sistine Chapel, you'll know it's the actual conclave. Some quick facts about the cardinal electors. As of today, there are 129 cardinals who can vote. By the end of the year, there'll be 120. 120 is the max, but they usually put it a little higher because during that year, so many will, once they become 80, are not in that list. So far, in the people who get to vote, 73% or 94 were created by Francis, 27 by Benedict, and 8 by Pope John Paul II. So obviously, it's not going to be long in these, because he's been gone for almost 20 years. But still, some of the people he elected are still voting. The youngest cardinal, I thought was interesting, is 49 years old. Think of that. He's got 30 years left of his life. He clearly will be voting for at least 1 or 2 popes. So he's going to be there a while. The oldest is 99.5. He'll be 100 years old in January 3rd. Obviously, he hasn't had a vote in the last 20 years, right? Because once you're over 80, there are more cardinals over 80 than not. They're living longer. And one of the next ones to not be an elector is Cardinal O'Malley. He will be 80 in June 29. So once he hits that date, so if the Pope doesn't die or resign before that date, he's just going to look pretty. The longest conclave lasted, was 2068. It lasted 33 months, where Gregory X was elected. The shortest was before 1274. There were times when a Pope was elected the same day as the death of his predecessor, with 10-day waiting period now, 15 days. 1503, Pope Julius was elected in just a few hours. All right. So, interesting facts.
And Father, did you say when that 80-year-old rule was put in place, or that's?
That was put in place a long time ago. Right? I don't know the exact date, but it's not changed in a long time, and it seems to be fairly well accepted. So I don't see it changing. It's not going to go up or down. These are in the last 100 years. On average, it takes 3 days to elect a pope. They vote once the first day, and then twice in the morning and twice in the evening after that. So Pope Francis, 5 ballots in 2 days. All right. So they had the 1 ballot the one day, which was in the evening, 2 the next day, and then in the afternoon, and then 2 in the evening. And he was elected in the 2nd ballot in the evening, the 5th ballot, and that was it. 2 days, 4 ballots, 3 days, 8, 2 days, 4. It's the last 100 years. We're not waiting for a long time. On average, 3 days.
Does it have to be unanimous?
It has to be 2/3 of the assembly, right? Of the number of voting cardinals. Today, there is a period of time, 15 to 18 days after the death of a pope, now or resignation. So that's why Benedict announced it, and then he stepped down 10 days later, and then the 15-day period started from the time that he stepped down. Right, so he had a formal speech where he, once that speech was done, her term completed. They gather on the first day of the conclave for a mass. They take an oath of secrecy. Hopefully they keep it. A cardinal will be excommunicated if they find out he has broken it. The doors of the Sistine Chapel are closed and sealed. Good example of it. That is in the Sistine Chapel. So that's kind of what the look likes. They're in 2 long rows, and it's a long process. That's why they can do 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. There's no dialogue in between them. When they break, they can talk, but not during it. Twice in the morning, twice in the evening, 2/3 vote to win. If there's 120, it's 85 votes. Ballots are burned, black smoke, no pope, white smoke, no pope. Day 13, if they do this, where there's 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and on the 13th day, they pause for a day of prayer and reflection. The runoff election between 2 leading cardinals who had the most votes on the previous ballot will take place after 13 days. Pope John Paul II revised that so that it wouldn't be going on forever. But again, the last 100 years it's been done in 3 days. What's the chance we're going to get to 13? Always possible, but that's what the work of the Holy Spirit, we hope. The Dean of the College of Cardinals asked the consent of the one elected to accept your canonical election. He immediately becomes Pope after he says yes. Then he says, by what name do you want to be called? My guess is they all go prepared with a name, just in case.
Who is the dean of the cardinal?
He's elected among them.
Okay.
All right, so they always have a dean, and that person knows. Ordinarily, the dean of the card will be the presider at the mass when the Pope dies. Now, when was that different?
Sorry, could the dean be the one elected?
Yes, and a good example of that would have been Pope Benedict, right? Because he was the dean, he presided at John Paul II's funeral mass because he was the dean, and he was actually elected. That's not always the case, but in that case it was. And it's just one person to be the facilitator to make sure things are carried out. Okay, so this is the presentation of the Pope. The most senior cardinal does so, and he says, I announce to you with great joy, Habamos Papam is the words we all look for. We have a Pope, pauses, everybody screams and hollers, and then they give the name. This is a picture of Vatican II. The magisterium are all the bishops with the Pope as the leadership. They are the teaching office of the church collectively, with obviously the Pope as its leader. So a good example of that is when our bishop speaks, unless he's speaking something that's contrary, which is generally not, then he is the word that we should be listening to in this diocese. Now, they're not often doing anything that's extraordinary. If they are, then there's going to be intervention, right? And that's when the Pope can intervene. And there have been a couple cases where people were asked to step down, resign, because they're whatever is going on that's not in unity with the church or the Pope. So the College of Bishops work together is what this point is. They have a threefold role. And I often like this piece. They preach and teach the vision of Jesus. They interpret, they're the guardian of Jesus' teachings, and they exercise the office of the magisterium together. That's why Pope Francis is trying to a little bit decentralize it. Not that he's giving up his role, but he wants the countries to deal with the issues of their country, which may be a little different in America than in North Africa, and so they have to pay attention to things that are pretty much not relevant to us, but relevant to another country. And so he wants the National Conference of Bishops to work together and try to be in unity with each other. But their role is to teach. Whenever a bishop's present in Mass, no one else should be preaching, with maybe exception that the bishop is present just to be there to be supportive. Say he's there at one of his priest's funeral for one of the priest's parents, and he's there just simply not to celebrate, but just simply to be in attendance. Then it's appropriate that he's there, but he doesn't have to speak. But otherwise, if the bishop is present, it is he is the teacher, and so he should be preaching. Right? He's the official teacher, and so should no one should be preaching, no one under that, one of his priests, for example, ordinarily. All bishops have what's called the fullness of the priesthood. This is the moment that a bishop makes a person a priest. So what is the fullness of the priesthood? Does anybody know what that means? If you can read, you got it? Right. So the sanctifying piece is that they can administer all 7 sacraments. All right. Most priests can administer 5 or 6. We are given permission to do confirmation within the rite of initiation. And only if you're a pastor is that right given. Associate pastors don't have that right. But it's given to the right of a pastor. If someone is brought into the church who is non-Christian, then the priest has a right to do all 3 sacraments in one ceremony, right? If someone is already Catholic, I cannot confirm them unless I have explicit permission and a good reason why. They should be going through the RCIA or going to the bishop on Pentecost Sunday, ordinarily, right? So, because the sacrament of confirmation is by and large reserved for the bishop. Ordination is only the bishop. They have the fullness of the priesthood. They can do all 7 sacraments. Priest has 5 generally, and a deacon has 2, baptism and marriage. All bishops have the power of jurisdiction over diocese, assistant of diocese, or lead some office of the Vatican. When a bishop retires at the age of 75, he gives up the power of jurisdiction. He is required at the age of 75 to write a resignation, but the Pope doesn't have to accept it. Sometimes they accept it quickly, sometimes they don't. And don't ask the reason for it, I don't know. For example, the Archbishop of Philadelphia, they had his ready to go. I think that they knew who they wanted to place there, which was one of their priests. So here in Wilmington, we're a smaller place. It wasn't that they weren't quick to get to that. And so Bishop Maluli was extended for almost 2 years before Bishop Koenig was named. The moment that the announcement came for Bishop Koenig, who was not a bishop, but it was a Monsignor, a priest, as soon as his announcement was proclaimed, as soon as that went public, then Bishop Maluli became an administrator and was no longer having jurisdiction. He was just kind of overseeing until the new seat was opened, right? When the new bishop was installed, right? So there's a clear guidelines in canonical law about when they start and end. And for that, as soon as the bishop says it, if the bishop says, accepts your retirement, but I don't have a replacement yet, then the bishop is done, and someone would be appointed administrator for the interim. And the administrator just makes sure everything is running smoothly until the formal bishop is there. Okay? You can go back and look at that. I just want to kind of run through that a little quickly to give you some background to lots of good information. I like all that stuff. All right. If we were expecting a new pope soon, that would be very interesting to go back and remember, because once everybody will forget. So I'm going to guess 4 years. No, if I wake up tomorrow morning and the Pope dies, but I made that public statement. So a little bit about these 3 popes that are part of the 21st century. So what I would like to do is to take these 3 popes, and although John Paul II was only for almost 5 years into the 21st century, we'll say something about him, because we haven't said much about him. Paul VI was done well with the Second Vatican Council. John Paul II's pontificate broke many records. Beyond the numbers, the leadership of the Polish Pope guided the Catholic Church through many rising challenges in modern times. 1978 to 2005. 27 years was a long time, and we rarely see a pope that long. Generally, you see from 10 to 15 years is but the average. One of the greatest challenges of his pontificate was the Cold War and the two blocs that pitted the world against each other. John Paul II had suffered firsthand from the oppression of the Nazi and communist regimes. His role was fundamental in the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. One of his first trips was to his native Poland in 1979. It became a defining point that encouraged Poles to fight for freedom in his own. And he had this great quote, "I plead with you, never ever give up on hope, never doubt, never tire, and never become discouraged." And his big line was, "Be not afraid." And he takes that from Scripture. So he did have a great role in that, and we're going to look at some pieces that he did. We could say with some certitude that even though Pope Francis has done a lot, this one put into motion the Pope leaving Rome a lot, right? So I'll call it the global papacy. He was a seasoned traveler, reached all corners of the world. He made 104 international trips and visited 130 countries. In terms of mileage, I didn't do this math, an article did. It's enough to go around the world 30 times. But interesting, there were two countries he was unable to visit, China and Russia. I picked this picture about one of his global trips because that was his visit to the Civic Center in Philadelphia, not just because it was Philadelphia, but I was actually there as a seminarian. And in the Civic Center was a mass for priests, seminarians, religious, and I sat on the, up in the bleachers in this line of the altar. So my first meeting of seeing a pope, I was only 20 years old, 21 years old. And I always remember being very fascinated by the red shoes. It was something I've never seen before. So I didn't know him a whole lot at that point. So that was one of his visits. One of the things he was noted for was his dialogue with Muslims and Jews. He referred to Jews as older brothers and became the first pope to step inside a synagogue. Interesting. He also prayed before the Western Wall. There's a picture of it. Pope Francis also did that. And he was also the first pope to kiss a Quran and step inside a mosque. And this is a picture of him in the mosque. And we can see he was a little bit older here. So he did a lot of work for inner dialogue there. The Assisi gathering was something very unique to his papacy. The first joint prayer was in 1986. More than 150 delegates from 12 religions heeded his call. It was on September 20th, 1986, and it was in Assisi. I was younger, I remember hearing about it, but I didn't pay as much attention to it in those days. But how profound in the 21st century for a pope to do that. So that was all part of his inner religious work. Considering how long he was in office, there were a lot of wars going on. He had survived World War II, and so he became a voice actively promoting a voice for against violence. He is not the first to say this. Never again war, never again hatred and intolerance. Who else said that?
Paul VI.
Paul VI said that, right? John Paul II said it. Pope Benedict has heard it saying it, and so has Pope Francis. So there is this, but he was a very strong advocate during his pontificate for against violence. Some of the people that he canonized, when it came to proclaiming saints, he canonized 482 saints over that 27 years. And Pope Francis did twice as many, but he did 800 of them at once. So you got to step back and look at that. And I'll explain that when we get to Pope Francis. So 482, one of those was a joint beatification of a married couple, Luigi and Maria Beltrame. And here are some famous ones that he canonized. Colby, Faustina, Josephine Bakhita, Catherine Drexel, because we looked at that one, and St. Leone Aviat. I was actually there for St. Leone Aviat's, so I was in Rome for that. And I do, there were two things that canonization I remember. I'm organized, and I said to the group, the Mass was going to be at 9 o'clock. So I said, I'm going to be in church at 7 a.m. when the doors open. You're being crazy. You're being silly. You're being over-neurotic. You're being obsessive-compulsive. But I'll take the criticism. We're leaving at 8 o'clock. I got to the church at 7 a.m. and I was in the aisle, right next to the aisle where the Pope was going to come up, but I was 2/3 back at 7 a.m. They got there at 8, and they all stood behind pillars outside. I like to be neurotic. But they got the point. But two things happened during that. One is my memory was everything seemed to be ready to go, and so I thought the Pope was coming down the aisle. But then I said to one of the brothers with me, well, who's this guy coming down the aisle? Like, why is he waiting till last minute? And shaking everybody's hand, and I shook his hand. And then after he passed, he said, well, that was Cardinal Ratzinger. So he went down the aisle, and then about 5 minutes later, the Pope-mobile came down, because he came down in one of those, he was on like a stairs, and he held on, and he was in bad shape. And that was in 2001. So that was November 2001, and he's still on 4 years ago, but he did not look good. But I have that distinct memory. Benedict, future Benedict, and the Pope, all in the same place. Not that it makes me any holier. So one of the things, because he had Parkinson's, I think he had an understanding of teaching the world about respecting life. You know, the throwaway culture was very relevant, and he made a point to remain active until his very last moments. And I think that's a tough picture to look at, but do many of us remember looking at that? That was his last audience, just a few days before he died, when he gave his weekly. I remember it was very hard to understand him, but he did it anyway. And I think that spoke to his doing the best he could to the very dying day. Forgiveness. In the year 2000, the Jubilee, in the Jubilee for the 2000 year, he formally apologized for the church's past errors. Now think of when this was, because this was before 2002, when all of the sexual abuse in the church broke. Because between 2002 and now it's been, but he was praying for the past errors. It was a stark moment which the Pope defined as a purification of memory, which allowed Christians to enter the third millennium more open to God. It was a very sacred moment that he did that, taking on all that for the world, and I thought that was very powerful. But you also may remember this date, right? When he was shot. And that's the last time that either a president or was this before Reagan? Was it before that?
No, it was during Reagan.
Yeah, but
No, I think it was before Reagan got shot.
Before Reagan got
Oh.
they were close to each other within a few months. Now, again, I want to be cautious about how I say things. That's the last time we know of anybody, of the Pope or. You got the point.
You got to my.
Because somebody I'm going to be upset. What I like about this is the individual who shot him, and he went and forgave him. I didn't have the date for that, but he did take some time to visit the prison, did his confession, and we don't know what was said there. Obviously, it was not revealed, but other than we know he forgave him. he wrote an encyclical to women. He was the first pope to write an apostolic letter directed to women. In it, he urged them to reflect on their personal, cultural, social, and ecclesiastical responsibilities. And then here's one of his quotes from that. "Thank you, women who are mothers. You have sheltered many human beings within yourselves in a unique experience of joy and triumph. This experience makes you become God's own smile upon the newborn child, the one who guides your child's first steps, who helps it to grow, and who is the author as the child makes, anchor as the child makes it along the journey of life." Beautiful quote, as he reflected on the different roles of women in that letter. Something unique. Clearly, he was a pope for young people, right? We all remember, these images are very relevant because Pope Francis kind of picked that up, but that was not seen before this. And he was useful when he was first elected, so he had a very big connection with the youth, especially with the World Youth Day. He said, if you live with youth, you have to become young. And he seemed to be able to do that well. Let me go back to this for a second. I do remember laughing. He said, "I, JP2, love you too."
Right.
And the crowd loved it. He had a way of connecting. So, can you pick out which one is Benedict?
The one on the right.
The one on the right, if you can read too. That's Benedict. That's his brother, his sister, mom, and dad. Yes, they do look very alike. Maria and Maria, Joseph and Joseph, and George. And don't correct that because I think that's how it's spelled. Okay.
OSFS, yeah.
Okay. So nice, interesting picture. I'm not going to do a lot of his youth, but the piece of his youth that I think is worth commenting on is that he was very much his family in Poland during the occupation. So there's a lot of dialogue in his biography about that. The family was anti-Nazi. His father, a policeman, subscribed to an anti-Nazi newspaper, was murdered by the Nazis, the editor. A 14-year-old cousin who had Down syndrome was taken away by the Nazis and soon died. He was presumably murdered in their inhumane campaign against those they considered defective. Young Reinzinger bristled against mandatory Hitler Youth activities and managed to dodge some, as he later recounted in his memoir, Milestones, as it's called. His older sister refused to become a teacher rather than be forced to teach a Nazi-friendly curriculum. During the Second World War, Ratzinger was conscripted into military service. He and his brother George both wanted to be seminaries. When the recruiter gathered Ratzinger and the other soldiers to a recruitment meeting, his desire to recruit won him mockery and insults, but also escape from service in the hardline Nazi military camp. So asking them that he wanted to be a priest, he didn't have to go as much. But he had to do some work. In the later months of the war, he deserted, which was an action punishable by death, but the war ended before they could catch up to him. He made a wonderful comment in New York in April 2008, a sinister regime that thought it had all the answers. And that's an interesting statement because that's going to happen again, because we get blinded in following people and where that could lead. So I think that sometimes people think someone else has all the answers and they may not have our best interest in mind. So when he became Pope, in 2005, it was April, soon after his election, he explained why he chose the name Benedict, right? He picked it for Benedict XV, who I thought was interesting because of his own experience. Guide the church through the turbulent times of the First World War, right? He was not guiding the church during war, but he was guiding the church in a very tumultuous time, probably one of the most difficult things, and that was during the sexual abuse. That was all under his time as Pope, and he had to deal with that. He said the name also invoked the 6th century monastic leader, Saint Benedict of Nursia, and his place in forming the irrefutable Christian roots of European culture and civilization. So he wanted to, much like Francis is going to have his own, he had this. We didn't say something much about John Paul, right? But I think we get that. He was very much interested in continuing the work of his two predecessors, John the 23rd and Paul the 6th, and that's why he did John Paul. It probably wasn't his idea, right? It was his predecessor's idea. But unfortunately, he only got to live for 33 days. So he wanted to continue that vision, which I thought was very inspirational. This is one of my favorite photos of Pope Benedict for several reasons. One, it's a very studious look, and I think it speaks a lot about him because he was a writer and a theologian and a deep thinker. And so I think that kind of picture captures some of that. He spoke of the need to evangelize in a very intellectual way. There is no greater priority than this, to enable the people of our time once more to encounter God. The God who speaks to us and shares his love so that we might have life in abundance. I think Pope Benedict was very good at putting the writing out there, and I think one of the strengths of Pope Francis is trying to speak to people in a way that they can understand it. Benedict had a more intellectual approach, and did successful as he could. Okay, one of the bigger challenges for him clearly was during the clergy abuse. And he, in his own time, had to begin to do a lot of work to figure out how to early respond to that. And there were many people that he began to laicize. Does everyone understand what that word means?
Mm-hmm. To defrock.
Defrock. What does that mean?
To take away his right to be a priest.
Correct. So laicize means that they are no longer clerical, right? And so they can do that. Now, pretty much only the Pope can do that. But today that process is for people who abuse that. So there was not a whole lot of that before that. It was excommunication around faith, but here there were issues that were very problematic, to say the least. As I mentioned before, he was one of the great thinkers and theologians. He was, we know what the Roman Curia is. We all know that. So, do you have any idea how many departments that involves? If you look up on the Vatican's, I couldn't put it all up here because it's like, it would take 3 slides. There are approximately 25 to 30 departments. And someone has to head each one of those. Some of those now can be women under Pope Francis, before they weren't. So some of those leaders can be women in those roles. At one time there were only cardinals. And those are the leaders of the church. And he was responsible for the one department called the propagation of the faith. And so he was wanting to make sure that the tenets of the faith were taught and so forth. And he had that role for over 20 years, working with Pope John Paul II, because of his intellect. But in this particular statement, ahead of the 2005 conclave that elected him to the papacy, Ratzinger spoke of a dictatorship of relativism that does not recognize anything as definitive and whose ultimate goal consists solely of one's own egos and desires. That's 2005. And I think he was spot on in terms of how relativism is taken over. And what that basically means is that what I say is truth, what I say is right, and I determine that, with no central tenets, and how problematic that is. He stressed that Jesus Christ is the measure of true humanism, and a mature faith and friendship with God serves as a criterion to distinguish the true from false and deceit from truth. And isn't that the truth? His books include Introduction to Christianity, a compilation of his university lectures, and Jesus of Nazareth, an effort to explain Jesus Christ to the modern world. Before his election as Pope, he gave 2 popular interviews with the German journalists who published these under the titles The Ratzinger Report and Salt of the Earth. So those documents contain a lot of his, capture a comprehensive group of his work. And there's a lot to think about there and will be considered and used extensively in the future. He inspired a renewal of Vatican II. He had a particular, I like this comment here. Benedict rejected interpretations of the council that stressed discontinuity and rupture. Rather, he said, the momentous council should be seen in the spirit of continuity and reform. Benedict was there at the Second Vatican Council as an expert with one of the cardinals. So he was there and got to witness that, and I'm sure that all influenced how he understood Vatican II. One of the things that he did was, that he did reverse, was allowing some places to say the Mass in Latin and given the guidelines for that. That he reversed from Vatican II. And Pope Francis continued to allow that, but gave it boundaries. Like there could be, if you want to do that, it's not in Vatican II's document, so it should be, so Pope Francis said, yes, it can continue, because Pope Benedict started it, but not in every parish can't do one. You do one place in each diocese where people can go to do that. And so that was kind of the guidelines for that at this time. He was obviously a confidant of Pope Francis because of his work with Pope Francis. One of the great things that he was involved in is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because that was put together under his leadership with Pope John Paul II. One of the things that Benedict got to do was to beatify his friend and co-worker, John Paul II, during his witness. He wrote, by his witness of faith, love, and apostolic courage, and accompanied by great human charisma, this exemplary son of Poland helped believers throughout the world not to be afraid to be called Christian, to belong to the church, and to speak of the gospel. In a word, he helped us not to fear the truth, because the truth is the guarantee of liberty. To put it even more succinctly, he gave us the strength to believe in Christ, because Christ is Redemptor Hominis, the Redeemer of man. So that was all the statement he made when he beatified Pope John Paul II. And then this came out of the blue, really. On February 11th, he shocked the world with that he was going to resign. I don't think people knew what to make of it. It was just so, well, because nobody alive in the world had ever seen it. It hadn't happened in 600 years. And of course, we all may remember seeing that. That's a great image of it. That's the Vatican, and that was right after he gave this speech. He said, I'm simply a pilgrim who is starting the last stage of his pilgrimage on earth. Let's go ahead together with the Lord for the good of the church and of the world. I think that he will be known for what he did there, in understanding of what he did, what he could, and accepted that, and trusted that he needed to put it in God's hands. That's a great act of faith, and I think he'll be known very well for what he did there. Good? Mm-hmm. We all lived through this, so this is a little bit more fresh. And like I said, I know I'm not saying everything about every one of them. And then this one's even easier because this one was still living on there. Pope Francis. So I guess one of the bishops in there, but this is the Sistine Chapel. So Pope Francis got dressed. One of the first things he does before we know anything is that he goes and puts on the white cassock, and then all the cardinals come up and greet him. So all of them that are present do that. And then he leaves, and then they go to the balcony to present him to the world. So these are the two. So this is Pope Francis, and before the world seen him as Pope Francis, all right, in the Sistine Chapel on that day. He was elected on the 5th ballot and chose the name Francis in honor of Francis of Assisi. And also recalling St. Francis Xavier, one of the founding members of the Jesuits. Sometimes people forget that. There are a couple of Francises that he's putting in motion. And if he's a good Jesuit, I know there's little Francis de Sales in him.
Father, I think he's the first one not to live in the Vatican apartments too.
Yes, I'm going to do a slide on the first for you.
Okay.
Okay?
He was everywhere, let you see them.
A man of many first. Okay? So the first was a Jesuit. Yes, the first who chose not to live in the apartments but to live simply. The first to do Mass, not privately, but with the sisters and people who worked in the Vatican.
No red shoes.
No red shoes, very simple.
No gold cross.
Mm-hmm. The first Pope from Latin America as well as the Southern Hemisphere. First to take the name of Francis. The first Pope to be elected after a papal resignation that anybody in the world today is alive to see, or in the modern era, you can look at it one way or the other. The first non-European to lead the Holy See since Gregory III, who was from Syria. The man of many first.
Mm-hmm.
After he was elected, one of the other firsts that he did that I put up here was that before he gave a blessing, he asked the world to pray for him.
Yeah, he said that.
That was a different beginning.
I remember that.
And then the next day he went and paid for his hotel room. Right? Those kinds of things that he wanted, and he kept his black shoes, he still wears them. At that time he said because somebody gave them to him, but obviously if they haven't worn out in 11 years, then he's a miracle. And of course, he's one of the first to start using Twitter and social media. This was his post for today. I'm sure he's not posting this stuff. My guess is that he must have a social communications department that may ask him so this is the quote that's put out there. During this month of May we entrust to the Blessed Virgin Mary our personal and family matters as well as the suffering of those who fall victim to war. Let us pray together for the Church, all nations, and for peace in Ukraine and the Middle East. Right. And each day he seems to write one. So there was 3 of them I looked at, and this was the one from this morning. There's the Pope Francis. You can follow it if you want. He's got them every day. One of the things he did, this is the Curia. One of the things he did, I think Pope John Paul II in 1988 set out to try to do that, but there were many other things to accomplish. But Francis actually went hard work to try to introduce new structures to change it. It's hard when there's a very strong ruling body, and the princes of the church don't like when you take power from them. So in their normal, anybody has power. You try to take it from somebody, they don't like it. But one of the things he tried to do, he ended the $25,000 euro bonuses paid to cardinals when they're on the board of supervisors of the Vatican Bank. Doesn't that sound awful, just reading that statement? Most people can live on $25,000, and that's a bonus for clergy. So that kind of stuff he was trying to reform and to get it to work more efficiently. And then one of the things he just a couple of years, it was 5 years now. Has it been 5 years? Been since 2019 years. Goodness. But he had the summit in February as a way of talking about sexual abuse and putting in some things in place. One of the things is he defrocked Cardinal McCarrick. I think that's one of the first times that actually a cardinal was removed. Other bishops have been. Now, other bishops have been, they weren't defrocked, but their jurisdiction of being in charge of a diocese has been removed for reasons that we may not always understand, but because of whatever he feels that they were not doing that he wanted them to do. There's not a lot of those, but I think there have been maybe 2 or 3 in the last 10 years. Right?
Mhm.
He was an advocate for women in the church. Prior to Pope Francis, only men could be instituted to the ministries of acolyte and lector. Now, you could be an acolyte and lector in a parish, but you couldn't have those ministries formally installed. So now you can, and we do that. That all changed in January 2021 when Pope Francis gave bishops the permission to institute women into those ministries. Francis also appointed a number of women to fulfill positions that were previously preserved for men. And there were some of the people that were in various departments in the Vatican. So he's changed a good bit there. He was an advocate for refugees. Following the spirit of St. Francis of Assisi, you know, he has trying to be a voice that of looking at deeper than just fear around immigrants and refugees. In particular, refugees who are escaping circumstances where there is persecution, and trying to sift through that. And there's no easy answer to that in the world, but that's being combated with nationalism, and he's trying to be a voice for where there's definite need. One of the ways he did that early on in his papacy was to go to this island of Lampedusa and did some prayers there and laid a wreath, and has done so a couple of times since. We all remember this one, his address to Congress. I don't think we've all seen him sit so obediently before. Do you remember hearing that speech? I didn't know what he was going to say, but I thought that it was very well researched, very poignant, because he really looked at the people in the country and made good connections, but spoke well in speaking to the individuals there. I remember I guess it was the Vice President was there, Speaker of the House, right? Who was that? Who was the Speaker of the House? He was crying. It was Ryan. Ryan? Is it Ryan? Boehner.
Boehner.
I just remember him crying. He was so moved by it.
Boehner was instrumental in getting him to come.
Yeah, and also he cried when he spoke. I remember
Yes.
visibly seeing it. These are moments of things he's done. Year of Mercy. That was a great year. I remember how powerful a year that was in preaching. I was only ordained 2 years at that point, so I thought that was a great moment for the church. Some of his writings, the Synod on the Family, was one of the great things he did. Although he does get some criticism here because it was mostly all bishops. And so I think that's why we had the newest synod with him listening to the laity, because he did get a lot of critique here about where were the men and women and families voices for this. But he got some good support on that. And then he gets a lot of critique on this one. A lot of people would prefer him not to talk about the environment, just mind his own business and stay with faith and matters. But he is very sensitive that his responsibility is that creation, the world, is ours to take care of, and so speaks his mind on that quite clearly. Some of the people he canonized. this is why I mentioned it, when I said Pope John Paul II canonized 400 and some people, he did 900 in just 10 years. However, read this part. So, this here. He canonized Antonio Primato and his 812 companions all at once. Right? They were the martyrs of Otranto, and in southern Italy. They were all killed on August 14th, 1480, after the city had fallen to the Ottoman force under Gedek Pash. So, I don't know much more about that, just I thought, number-wise, he covered a lot of people in one. But when I looked at the yearly list, it was anywhere from 6 to 10 people a year that he's canonized, which would be in similar fashion to what John Paul II did. Just that John Paul II had 27 years to do it, and he's only done 11. Some of the ones that, and most of them were done in the Vatican now. Most of the canonizations are done at the Vatican, minus a few exceptions. All the beatifications tend to take place in the city from where that individual was known from. I think that's a process that they're doing. The exception here is at the Shrine of Saint of the Basilica in D.C. was where Saint Juniper was canonized, right here when he was visiting in 2019. And then we all know the East Trees of Calcutta, some popes. Good. Pope Francis canonized 2 recent popes in the presence of an immediate predecessor, Pope Benedict. A lot of articles called that the Day of 4 Popes. That when we're going to see that again, when 2 popes were present for the canonization of 2 popes. That's extraordinary, and we get to live through that. It took place on Divine Mercy Sunday, and that is not correct. That should be 2014, right?
Sure thing.
150 cardinals were present, and 700 bishops, not counting everybody else. It's quite a mass. I put these images up because I think these are images that it may take another 500 years to see. 2 popes praying together and both alive. 1 pope presiding over the funeral of another. He was smart. When his resignation, he knew that a pope was going to preside at his funeral. And some of these other images of the 2 of them together at different times. I just think that this speaks great deal. Other images I love are when the cardinals were created, usually both of them were present. So that we won't see that for a long, long time.
Father,
Mm-hmm.
you know, Pope Francis loves the poor. It was one of the first things he was famous for saying, that, you know, his love for the poor. He installed showers in the colonnades. You know, the colonnades with it, and supplied the poor with towels and soap. And I think on certain, like the days when he didn't have his audience, they were free to go and shower. And he also asked the barbers who were off on Mondays, if they would volunteer to give him haircuts.
And they did.
I read that in Reader's Digest.
And there's a lot of stuff he does that's not seen.
Right.
And it's interesting that each of the pontiffs, in their own right, in their own personalities, did what they thought that they needed to do as the interpreter of the moment for leading the Catholic Church. And I think they teach us that, you know, the Lord provides what we need when we need it. And sometimes we think we know better when we need to trust the Holy Spirit, you know, in these. None of these, there's not been any real, in fact, there's not been any change in church teaching among the 3 popes at all. You know, it's just that their approach is very different. And that's that's the Lord's choosing through the Holy Spirit. So that takes us to where we are in 2024. The last thing I would like to do to kind of complete our church history chapter is to look at some distinctive, what are the very specific distinctive things from Catholicism to others. I'm just trying to name some of those so that we're all a little bit more conversant when we're dealing with our brothers and sisters who don't believe the same thing. That we don't just demonize the others, but we understand what their points are, and then we can help them understand ours in terms of the real differences. So say a prayer that I can get that all in writing in a good way
It's gonna be very interesting.
between the next 7 days. Okay?
That would be nice.
All right, thank you very much.